Happy Friday, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's COVID-19 update on state policy responses and other executive actions to the coronavirus in public schools. My name is Nikki Sparks, and I'm the Director of Operations, Student Programs, and Special Projects at NAESP. Please take note that today's discussion will be recorded and available upon request. All attendees' mics will be muted, but we do encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the chat box. They will be monitored and responded to throughout the discussion. I would now like to introduce NAESP Executive Director, Dr. Earl Franks.
Thanks, Nikki, and thanks to all of you for joining us on this topic of important implication of coronavirus and COVID-19 on state education policies and budgets. We're excited today to have with us Jeremy Anderson, President of Education Commission of the States. Jeremy leads a team of more than 55 education policy experts that serve policymakers in all 50 states through research, reports, convenings, and counsel. I guess you would say his members are the governors, state legislatures, state education chiefs, etc. Also, we have Jennifer Thomsen, Policy Director at Education Commission of the States, who also serves as Director of their Knowledge and Research Center. She oversees the state policy database, which contains summaries of enacted education legislation in all 50 states and DC, responds to requests for information, writes and edits materials, and conducts and synthesizes research on state education policy. And joining us also as the Associate Executive Director of Policy and Advocacy for NAESP, Danny Carlson. Thanks to them for being with us. And we'll turn it over to Jeremy Anderson to begin the presentation. Jeremy?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Earl, and glad to be here and glad to provide some insight on what we're seeing in state policy and changes that are already being considered. A little bit of background just about us. We really look at ourselves as an essential, indispensable member of any team addressing education policy. It's pretty important for the work that we do that we're able to help states understand what they can do and how they can look at some of these policies. And so if you want to go ahead and advance to the next slide, a lot of the work that we do is really around tracking every single state policy. We don't know what your state needs. We do know what the 49 other states have already done to tackle some of these problems, which means we have an immense amount of data and policies that we can share with other states. Our membership, if you go to the next slide, is really 350 commissioners that are in statute in each state. Every governor, every chief state school officer, in most states, it's the chair of Senate Education, chair of House Education, higher education executives, and usually an early learning expert. And so when you look at next slide, the demographics of who we have, we're one of the only national organizations that have all of these players that come to our meetings and we serve collaboratively. A lot of times when we're in a state, back when we used to travel, we would pull together our 7 commissioners in a state, and it was interesting. They know each other. They work with each other. But someone would almost always say, wow, we haven't been in the same room since the governor's holiday party last year. They're busy people, and so our goal is to bring them together so that they can think creatively about how they can do policies and how they can work better together. Next slide. We believe a lot in the strong power of learning from experience, and we have a lot of elected officials and a lot of great people in the roles that our commissioners play, but it doesn't mean that all of them are education experts. Sometimes if you're the chair of Senate Education, it may mean that you're actually there for 2 years because your goal is to become chair of Ways and Means or Appropriations. And so we're here to help those experts understand the broader policy issues and what other states are doing. Next slide. And we do most of this through 4 categories that we call research, report, counsel, and convene. Our research is what we're going to talk to you about here today and how we're tracking every single piece of legislation, every executive order, and every policy that's going on in all 50 states. We use that research to create reports. We've got a series of those that are on our website and available. It's everything from tracking all of the governor's state of the state addresses and what their promises were in January, to even papers like one we released a couple of weeks ago about trauma-informed policies that schools should be considering for students. We do a lot of our counsel, which is working directly with our commissioners. whether we're traveling to the state or whether we're doing seminars like this for them to help them better understand the complicated issues around school finance or career and tech ed or workforce training or what they need to be doing about the transition from middle school to high school. And then we do a series of convenings, usually about 20 of these across the country each year. And our convenings are really where we try to bring together people regardless of party affiliation or what their knowledge base is on education. We have a lot of very liberal senators from some states and some very conservative representatives from other states. And amazingly, they'll sit at the same table together because they're not really worried about what someone's going to say in the papers. They come to our meetings so that they can learn more about the trends and what's happening in education policy across the country. If you want to go to the next slide, Nikki. One of the biggest things that we really do is track all of our policies in a state education policy tracking website. This is a massive database of every education bill that's out there. We review every single piece of legislation in every state. And it's really important because this gives us a sense of what's happening in the states and what they're looking at. You can go to the next slide. What we do with this data is not only use it for our reports and to help educate people across the country, but we look at what are the key issues. These are the 2020 trending issues in education that we have already seen moving, and we continue to update on those on a regular basis. And we've got a couple of papers we've released that go in depth on some of these. If you want to go to the next slide, Nikki, which really highlight where we're seeing states take some major action. And what I want to do now is turn the microphone and the camera over to Jennifer Thomsen. And Jennifer actually leads a team of 11 who have been instrumental in helping us to really take the data of all of this legislation and look at what these policies mean and where states are. So Nikki, if you want to unshare the slide, I think Jennifer is going to try to share her screen so that she can walk you through our database so that you've got a pretty in-depth look at what this can do for you and where you can get this information. And then when Jennifer's complete, we want to open up a Q&A with Earl and Danny and Jennifer and I on what are the policies and trends that you want us to try to help give you a greater insight or even a crystal ball on. So I'll turn it over to you now, Jennifer.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeremy. And I just want to make sure you can see my screen. Everything looks good there. Okay, excellent. So before I talk to you a little bit about our COVID resources, and we do have a lot of them, I just wanted to provide a little bit of additional context around our policy work, specifically the work that my team and the other members of the policy team do. We recognize that policy responses to education issues happen at many levels. You know, there's federal level legislation and guidance, the state level action, which can look like legislation, departmental regulations, executive orders. And as you know, a lot of work takes place at the district level and the school level and at the institutional level in the higher ed space. So we do recognize and acknowledge that all of these layers are important. But as Jeremy noted, our primary audience is state policymakers. And so state level policy is really our focus. So with that as kind of a backdrop, I just wanted to take you through some of our COVID resources that I hope will be helpful to you. So what you're seeing here is the front page of the ECS website. I want to take you over to our state policy tracking, which is one of the things Jeremy was just talking to you about. So as he mentioned, one of ECS's core functions, and a function that we have been doing since the mid-90s, is to track education legislation across the country. When legislation reaches final action, whether that be enactment or vetoed, anything that reaches the governor's desk, our staff analyzes and then summarizes. And what I always tell people I'm talking to is, we read the bills so you don't have to. We actually like doing that. Most people don't, so let us do that work for you. We track legislation in 45 broad issue areas that encompass about 250 education topics. And as I mentioned, we've been doing this for a long time, so our archive is really extensive. And the purpose of this is to provide our key constituents, state policymakers, with examples of policy approaches that other states are using to address any issues that they may be facing in their states. As Jeremy mentioned, our goal is to connect states and not have them constantly reinventing the wheel. We want to learn from experience. So this is one really great way to do that. So I just wanted to give you a really brief tour of our policy tracking map. I am going to circle back to the COVID issue, but I wanted to show you this because I do think, perhaps for you, knowing what's going on in states on lots of issue areas could be really helpful for you. So just as an example, what I'm going to do for you here is filter down a little bit so you can see what we're talking about. So on our map, you can filter by year, by issue, by sub-issue, and then also by state. So just as an example, we know that teaching is always a hot topic. So I'm going to filter here by teaching so that you can see the enacted and vetoed teaching bills that we've been tracking just since the beginning of 2020. And then I'm going to drill down a little bit into compensation bills. So you can see here that the map is resetting itself as we go along. And we have a list of bills below here that deal with that issue. If I click on the arrow here beside the bill, this is the staff summary I was telling you about. One of our staff read what was probably a multi-page bill and condensed it down for you into a one-paragraph summary of the bill. So as I mentioned as well, or maybe I didn't mention it yet, there are also a few key issues that we track from introduction. We know an important part of the policy story isn't just what ended up passing, what made its way to the governor's desk, but all of that legislation that sort of never gets there, but that we see come up over and over again. It's important for us to see how states are working on things, even if it's not making its way all the way through the process, just because we know there are a lot of issues that come up time and again, and states are trying hard to get it right. So we have what we call our state policy watch list. And here each year we identify a few key issues that we are going to track from introduction. And of course, we've just recently added to this list education policy responses to COVID-19. So states are introducing all sorts of legislation about COVID-19, but we're really just pulling out the education pieces because that's what we care about and what our constituents care about. So what we do know and what you know is states are trying to build an airplane while it's flying on their COVID responses. So they're kind of in triage mode. So a lot of the legislation we're seeing so far is really just dealing with things that are happening right now, waiving requirements right now, but not really yet looking forward to what that might mean in the fall when we waived the spring assessments, for example. We're also seeing a lot of legislatures who are wanting to provide more flexibility to districts and to schools to deal with these things and, deal with a really rapidly changing situation in their own context at the district level. The other thing that's important to understand here is that a lot of legislatures have either adjourned or temporarily recessed because they're not wanting to meet together. And so we think a lot of this legislation action is going to be coming in fits and starts throughout the year, which is very unusual. We don't usually see that happening. But what it means is in terms of state level policy actions, really governors, chief state school officers at state boards are maybe better positioned to act quickly than legislatures are. But having said that, we have seen, this is as of the end of the day yesterday, I haven't checked again this morning, but as of the end of the day yesterday, we've seen 95 COVID-related bills introduced in legislatures. The majority of them are still pending, but we have already seen enacted legislation in 19 states and DC. And the legislation, as I mentioned before, has been pretty limited in scope, providing flexibility, waiving things like assessments and some graduation requirements, instructional time requirements, and those sorts of things. And as of my scan yesterday, we really have not seen anything that sort of addresses the downstream issues caused by, what's happening now. So as we think about the key issues that Jeremy shared with you a moment ago, it's easy to imagine, and that every one of them is going to feel some long-term impact of COVID. And so we have been watching really closely what states are doing in the moment to try to address some of those issues. But we're trying to think long-term, or at least mid to long-term, about how we can help them when they're sort of facing some of the consequences of the snap decisions that they're needing to make right now. So we've put a lot of this information on our website on this page that you can see here, which we are updating once a week. I didn't mention that the bill tracking that I was just showing you does update 5 days a week. This COVID-19 resource we are updating once a week. So it's not our intention to catalog every state policy action. We tried that a little bit at the beginning, and it's impossible because there's so much going on. So what we're trying to do is pull out state examples that other states can look to and other constituents can look to about how states are handling specific issues. So I just wanted to sort of walk you through this a little bit quickly so that you can see the resources that we have that I hope will be helpful to you going forward. One thing I also wanted to note is we are partnering with a number of other organizations that are also trying to keep up with what's happening in this space. So a lot of times if we can't answer a question, we can connect you with another organization that can. So just kind of starting at the top here, we do provide some information on federal guidance and then a lot of information on governor's actions and state guidance. And that looks like closure orders, guides for LEAs and for schools, departmental FAQs, webinars, and those sorts of things. But what may be of more interest to you is some of the topic-specific information that we have been collecting. And I'm gonna go through a few of these. We do focus on state examples because that's what our commissioners tell us they really like. But we do have other resources here. Again, I'm just gonna provide a few highlights, noting that we are mostly concentrating on state level policies, though we know a lot of great things and hard decisions are being made at the district and school level. We do know that. You're gonna see as I'm going through here that I'm gonna skim over finance. We're going to come back to it. I just wanted to let you know we're not going to ignore it because I know that you're interested in that. So in the assessment and accountability space in particular, what we're seeing here is mostly waivers. So we know the US Department of Ed approved waivers for all 50 states and DC, but there are some states that are moving to waive other sorts of assessments in addition to summative assessments. So for example, in Massachusetts, the commissioner is allowed to waive diagnostic assessments. In Tennessee, they've waived all of their TCAP assessments. So in addition to summative assessments, they're waiving assessments that English learners need to take and end of course assessments. Interestingly though, in Tennessee, the legislature has specifically allowed districts to administer assessments if they want to. So it's not sort of a statewide moratorium on assessments. We've found that state action in the early learning space, there's just less of it. And I think that it may be for a couple of reasons. One is not every state provides state funding to early learning. So maybe there's sort of just less state movement to happen. The other thing is early learning governance is really decentralized. And so that can slow things down as you have more departments involved in that. Excuse me. And here's the part where I'm going to scroll past finance. We'll come back. Another thing where we have seen a lot of state level action is on instructional time requirements and graduation requirements. So as I mentioned, a lot of states have waived their minimum instructional time requirements altogether, and have given districts flexibility about making up that time, but waiving the required hours or days. We've also seen a lot of states give districts flexibility in setting graduation requirements for the students who were on track to graduate at the beginning of the spring semester. There have been a few other states that have been a little bit more prescriptive about what can be waived in terms of graduation, but mostly it's been just sort of trying to provide flexibility to districts. This is an issue that we know a lot of people are really worried about, and we're just watching it play out in real time. Jeremy and I both have kids who are in high school, and I would say we're both probably really, really glad that neither one of them is a senior. This is a really hard time. Another thing, obviously, we're hearing a whole lot about is remote learning for students who aren't in school. And policymakers across the country are really grappling with this. There are some states that haven't had a much better existing infrastructure for remote learning, same, there are districts as well. And what we're really seeing is a lot of this is really shining a light on some big equity issues. States are trying to figure out, how do we give kids what they need to learn at home when they don't have access to a device or they don't have access to the internet? States are finding that they need to come up with some creative solutions, but I think what we've seen so far is it really has been left to districts and schools to do a lot of that work, and it's a struggle. I think we'll continue to monitor that, and it'll be interesting to see where that goes. The last issue area I kind of wanted to highlight, because it's one that we're hearing from policymakers about a lot, is a lot of teacher issues. And a couple of the big ones that we're hearing about is how do we handle student teaching requirements? We had student teachers out in the schools that can't be there now. So how do we get these teacher candidates licensed? And while a lot of people are talking about it, we haven't seen a lot of movement there. We have seen a little bit of state level movement on teacher evaluations. A couple of states we've seen are just suspending some provisions related to teacher evaluations. They're, waiving the use of student growth in evaluations, or waiving requirements for observations. In Louisiana, they suspended the provisions that make the renewal of credentials dependent on an evaluation. And again, here though, a lot of state policymakers are saying to districts, we're going to give you flexibility to figure this out. So that's some of the, I can see that there's quite a few questions coming in. That's just kind of some of the high level highlights that I wanted to provide, thinking about what we're hearing from policymakers that they're really worried about right now. So I know, of course, you're interested in the financial implications of COVID, and I know Jeremy has some information for you on that. We have collected some information here in our resource. It's not really comprehensive because I think states are just trying to figure out what they're going to do with this. We know that states' tax revenues are going to see an immediate hit. And so, especially in states where districts rely very heavily on state funding, there are going to be a lot of impacts there to deal with. So, Jeremy, I might, if you don't mind, throw it back to you here to talk a little bit about the finance piece of it.
Yeah, we've been working with a lot of national organizations, especially the National Association of State Budget Officers. And nobody has a crystal ball right now on what that's going to look like or what it should end up looking like. But I think the reality that we're going to find is that many states are going to be looking at cuts, maybe even here in 2020. So the stimulus package has some money for states, which I know the feds are talking about the great investment it is, and it's helpful. But the reality is, for the stimulus package, it's an average of a 1.9% increase for states. I think Connecticut has the lowest percentage increase. It's only a 1% increase for them. Mississippi has the highest percentage increase. It's only a 3.8%. It's helpful. But looking at where states are probably going to have budget revenue problems, one of our analysts actually did some work. If state funding decreases by 5% this year, even if you add the stimulus in, 37 states are going to have to cut education funding. If state funding actually goes down by 10% in states, it's going to result in all 50 states having to cut education at some point, even with the stimulus funds being applied to schools. And so I think there's going to be some really difficult discussions that are going to be taking place. I don't think that a majority of states are going to actually cut the budgets until they come back into session in January. I think many states are going to do some stopgap issues, and then they're going to wait for their governor to announce a new budget that would include cuts or maybe revenue increases to bring the budget back into a balance. It's going to be really difficult, though. And I saw we had a question from Naomi on equity. This is my 5th Zoom presentation this morning, and equity is the #1 conversation that's coming up. I worry that it's not going to be an issue. It's only going to be a conversation. A lot of the issues around equity that states have been working on, achievement gap and others, are areas where additional funds have been plugged in for specialized programs to help certain demographics or geographic areas. If the budget cuts are as drastic as they may be, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion and conversation on equity, but I'm not sure that we're going to see actual policies that are focused on equity. And so there's a lot that's going to be coming up quicker in June, probably, when many states have to have some kind of a consensus revenue estimating group that will meet and say, where are the revenues when we're getting ready on July 1 to start the new fiscal year? But until we get to that juncture, it's a lot of questions, because many states also have allowed, like the federal government did, for residents to not pay their income taxes until June. And that's to help residents during this tough time, but it also means that states don't fully understand what are the revenues that they were going to have coming in order to do that kind of assumption for the next fiscal year. Are there other specific questions on finances or policies?
Yeah, I have some questions, but I want to go to Nikki first, and let's make sure that we address all the questions that came in on the chat or the Q&A.
Sure. There was another question that was submitted by Naomi. Are teachers providing only enrichment, or are they providing instruction with feedback to students and possibly a grade?
That's a great question, and it is all over the place. There are a lot of states that their executive order has really said that there will not be face-to-face schooling for the rest of the academic year. And a lot of those fine questions you have there are being done district by district by district. There's a large number of big districts we know of where kids have been promised that the grade they had when the school closed is the grade they will keep, so they can bring the grade up, but they won't take the grade down, which is also probably, my wife's a preschool teacher, making it difficult for some of those students to fully engage. A lot of the teachers are trying to do their best. There's some districts where we've seen who have done some really innovative things, but there's a lot of these teachers who they have not planned for online learning, and it's taken them a while to get up and running where they actually have instruction that they can be providing to the students. And I think we're going to see some issues because of this. NWEA, who's been one of the national assessment firms for years, they actually looked at summer slide issues for 3rd through 5th graders. They had analysis on over 5 million students that they had tested. And they took the normal summer slide and extended it for a 5-month period instead of a 3-month period. And the numbers are scary. I mean, the numbers show that for 3rd through 5th graders, the reading will drop. The students will only keep 70% of their reading comprehension when they go back to school, and for math and science, it drops even worse. And without an assessment that's being done, and we understand why those waivers were given, but without an assessment, if we go back to school in the fall, many of these teachers are going to be getting students who have a much larger summer slide than usual, and the teachers don't have any assessments to help them understand where was that student when they left school in March or early April.
That's great. There's one comment and another question. The comment was, another item to keep an eye on is retirement pensions. And the question was, IDEA and the US DOE does not seem to be giving any flexibility of mandates. Is there any update?
Danny may want to weigh in on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I can give a quick update. The DOE has given what was an initial response. There was some blowback. And so they clarified in an FAQ document to say schools and districts should basically do what they can under circumstances to try to meet students with disabilities needs and IEPs under these circumstances. But in the CARES Act, there's a provision that asks the Secretary of Ed to provide recommendations on IDEA flexibilities within 30 days. The CARES Act was signed on March 27th, so we're expecting something, I would say probably next week. NAESP and NAESP sent a joint letter to the Secretary directly outlining some flexibilities that we want to see, including some timeline flexibilities, just the reality of IEPs and the sort of the circumstance we're in. So we should know something really soon.
And Danny, you may want to mention the collaboration that we're working with AASA and a couple of organizations on some flexibility.
Yeah, so related to this, kind of the sequence is CARES Act, including the CARES Act, was a requirement for the Secretary to provide those recommendations. Congress is then going to take those recommendations and do something in statute around IDEA flexibilities. And so we're working with AASA and other organizations to basically kind of shape that language in terms of what is a good intersection of kind of recognizing the environment we're in, but still, you know, obviously principals and administrators and everyone else are doing everything they can to still serve those students. So we think that once we get that language finalized, that likely in the next coronavirus response package that there will be language with that IDEA flexibility.
And my hope is to come back in a few minutes and talk a little bit about the CARES Act and where we're at there. And I'd encourage everyone who's online to please type a question, whether it's about policy or specific funding issues, type that into the chat box. But Jeremy, Jennifer, I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball. So knowing that the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities earlier this week estimated that states will collectively lose close to $500 billion next fiscal year. And seeing that K-12 makes up more than a quarter of the state's budget, and in some states, it amounts to more than a half. You mentioned the number of states if 5% cuts and then 10% cuts. I know this is a crystal ball, hypothetical. Where do you see on the projections now, where do you see it coming down on the percentage of cuts?
I wish we could answer that. I think it's going to be pretty deep. Ed Week had a report out this morning where they were talking with a lot of different state experts, and I think the headline used the word draconian cuts. I'm just looking at the reality for some of these state budgets where K-12 funding has been increased over the last few years, but in many states, it's really just gotten back up to where it was before the last financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. And so I am fearful that it's going to be dramatic cuts. And if you've got a, say, 15% cut in a state budget, there are some governors who will protect education to some degree, but when it's 50% of your total general fund expenditures, you can't protect it without literally closing other agencies, which won't be done. And so I think it's going to be very difficult. I do think it's going to be slow before some of those cuts are made. I think state policy leaders are doing a lot of work, and all of you at NAESP are in the trenches trying to keep this moving. But the state policy work, they've been doing really, their focus has been just on how are we going to respond to this crisis. And so the response has been triage and mitigation on small things that need to make it work for the end of this school year. The word we're using is rebuilding. And I don't think states are going to be ready to start looking at how do they rebuild their education system until 2021 or maybe beyond. And I think there's going to be a lot of tough questions that state leaders are going to focus on the health issues first. How do you start school in the fall if you've got a high school with 2,000 children if we don't have testing of some kind yet? And I think these are going to be the kind of things that your members, the principals and district leaders, are going to be grappling with more than state leaders will be actually taking policy into action. I think their actions are going to come much closer to January, February, when they're in a new session and they're actually trying to rethink how do we do this for the long haul. And also, what did we learn through this crisis that might have been innovative ideas or policies that we do need to consider and put into place long term with some online learning?
I have another question before I flip it back to Nikki to follow up on some questions in the chat box. And, you know, Jennifer talked about right now, it looks like most of the policies are reactive as opposed to being proactive moving forward. But probably in that same article you referred to this morning, Jeremy, and question for you is, have you heard similar from your members and states? Notice that the governor of Hawaii is considering cutting teachers and other public employees' pay by 20% starting May 1st. Is that a trend that you're seeing across states, or just right now it's isolated?
Every state is special and unique, and I start many of my comments like that. Hawaii is one of the only states we've seen that, but it's also because Hawaii is really one school district for the entire state. So the governor, if they were looking for a way to save, would be able to do that. In most states, it would be a cut to state budgets, and then district leadership would have to figure out how they're going to absorb those cuts. But we do have other states who I know are already running numbers to see what kind of cuts are we going to have to look at. Can we sustain where we're at through January and wait until then when the legislature's back, or do we have to have a special session? As a majority of the legislatures, they're not full-time legislatures, so they really are only in for about 3 or 4 months. Some have already adjourned because of COVID-19. Others are on a longer recess than usual. Many state legislatures, though, there is a date in their constitution by which they will have to be done with all of their work, or they call a special session.
Nikki, do we have some other questions in the chat box? And I want to give Danny a few minutes here to ask questions of Jeremy and Jennifer as well.
Sure, we do have 2 questions in the queue. The first of one is, will free and reduced meals have the option to continue over the summer? Our families are depending on this for more than just their children in many cases.
So we haven't gotten a lot of guidance on that I've seen yet. Jennifer, have you seen anything yet?
No, I haven't. I know, I mean, we're hearing from states about it, and certainly they're, you know, wanting to have policy solutions for that. But I think that's one of those still developing areas. Danny, I guess you might know more about, you know, waivers from the federal level if there's movement.
Yeah, so the latest thing in an earlier, I think it was early, like March 9th, the earlier package included state waivers through USDA. And so all 50 states applied for that. And what that allowed is for the summer school meals programs to be used currently to do the meal deliveries and kind of mobile pickups. And so that extends, I can't remember how long, but it extends for a while. School districts will be able to use that. I think the question will just be money on that, because the summer lunch programs will run out. But I don't see any universe where that's not going to get refilled. The one thing that is interesting on this is there's 2 states have done this move to pandemic EBT, which is, when you think about schools and kids, and you know, school meals are great, but there's just going to be just huge food insecurity issues for a lot of kids. And so Tennessee and I think one other state is taking advantage of this pandemic EBT, which allows kids to, you know, go to the grocery store and use kind of to get food, or, you know, that sort of thing. So that's one other little trend.
Thanks, Danny. I actually do have two other questions. Another one just came in. The first is, we brought it up in passing before, but can you, if you have any information, can you address the question on retirement and potential pension issues?
So the retirement issue has been one of the most prominent in states on education funding for a long while. And there are a lot of states that their retirement funds or the teacher fund, depending on how it's set up, is not set up for the long term. And there are going to be some tough times. And that's before we find out how did the stock market bear on those funds in the last month or two. Jennifer, I don't know if you have anything extra on some specific legislation.
Yeah, I have only seen one piece of legislation that has passed that addresses retirement and benefits at all. But it's pretty interesting. In Pennsylvania, actually, a piece of legislation that they passed specifically says school entity employees, is what they say, will experience no loss of retirement benefits due to the pandemic. I mean, I don't know what that looks like long term. I don't know if that's a promise they can make, but it is a promise they made in this piece of legislation. I think we're really still, as Jeremy said, in the talking about it phase. I certainly haven't seen any specific state policy action other than that Pennsylvania bill.
Let me get in here with a question, Nikki. We'll come back to you and then Danny as well. Jeremy, looking at the number of states, districts that rely on sales and income tax revenue, we know that those are going to fluctuate a lot. And we also, you talked about the equity piece, those districts with little to no property tax revenue are in a worse position. From a state funding perspective, what's the percentage look like on those states that rely on sales and income tax as opposed to those that have some property tax in their state budgets, education budget?
So those that have property tax, there's probably more solid ground, at least right now, but we tend to see in these financial times, that's also when legislators feel that they're getting pressure to lower property taxes to help their constituents out. On the sales and income, numbers are just starting to roll in just really off March. And in some states, that was a big issue. In other states, we really hadn't seen the closings yet. I think it's going to be a tremendous drop on most of those. And it's going to be really hard in some of those states to figure out how you make that back up. We're also seeing, just trying to look forward a little bit. I mean, there's a couple universities, as I said, who are talking about not having classes for the entire fall and starting up the education year like January 1. I think there's some policy questions there because they may be saying, I'm not sure we can do online learning for an entire semester and that people are going to pay for their children to go to college when it's just an online class. I think we may see some states and districts that start to have that same question for health reasons on, do we have a fall semester of K-12 services? And so trying to think more into that, and I don't have a crystal ball on that, the issues that come into play are, okay, then does that district furlough those teachers for that semester? Does that district have contracts with those teachers and those staff and keep them there? I mean, there's some big economic issues. And you see from the federal government, I mean, the Paycheck Protection Program and others trying to help small businesses keep people employed. I think there will be some tough districts who know cuts are coming, who may have to think, do we try to continue to pay all of our employees if we aren't going to have school for the entire amount of time in the fall that we thought we would? And it's going to be really difficult.
Danny, I'll give you some time here. Did you have any questions for Jeremy or Jennifer?
Nikki, was there anything else in the chat box that you wanted to raise?
One question did come in. The previous one, Jeremy did touch on, which was, do any of your projections look at the possibility of closures going into the fall, September, October? So you did just touch on that. Thank you. You do have a crystal ball of sorts, apparently. The new question that came in is, what are lessons we are learning from other countries who are able to keep afloat at this time? Obviously, the United States has been the most extreme of the cases when compared to other countries around the world at this point.
I can chime in on that one a little bit. We actually are just seeing some research come out of China about some of the education challenges that they faced there. Literally just seeing it. I have not read it yet, but certainly it's something that we want to be looking to and thinking about, and we will be doing that coming forward. I think, part of the issue for us as we're trying to sort of identify things that are successful is it takes time to evaluate what's successful. So unfortunately, there's sort of a lag with that. So long answer for the short answer, which is don't know.
I think Germany is another country that we're going to see some. Chancellor Merkel has talked about slowly reopening the economy. That's a country that did significant testing across the entire country. But it's also a leader who's been pretty realistic in saying, to open up our economy, we may have 10 restaurants in a community and we'll open one of them. And after a slow period of time, we'll see if we have the ability to open 2 of them because we're not having additional health issues. And she had a couple of press conferences this week where she talked about what does that mean for schooling? Does that mean that just some kids come back? Does that mean that we do kids in waves, like there's a smaller number that are there in the morning and then a different number that are there in the afternoon, so that we still have social distancing as they're trying to open their economy back up? I think there's going to be a lot that we can learn from a few of those countries who are going to be doing this ahead of us. Either way, this is new territory that is not normal. And until we have testing, I think there's going to be a big discussion across our country on how quickly can we open up a high school that has 2,000 kids and have everyone come back.
Great, I'll jump in now. So my question is, I have 2 questions. One is, you talked about these state budgets and the challenges, the slowing economy. I think one thing that's interesting, and I want to get your take on this, is we look to the Great Recession in terms of 2009 and what happened in state budgets, and we said there's this amount of slowdown. But the thing now is that what we're looking at is a double whammy, because you've got the slowing economy, and now you've got the issue of school closures and all the associated costs, and that wasn't true 10 years ago of school closures. So I think the needs of schools and principals is very different and greater. So I want to get your thought. There's going to be, Jeremy, you mentioned the federal money that's coming down. I will say I agree with what you said about that. Right now it's not very much, but this first wave is just really the emergency. There's going to be a big pot coming. But there's going to be, in early May, very likely $13 billion that's going to come down into districts that SEAs have to turn around and kind of push down into districts. And that's for coronavirus response. But there isn't language that in that bill that says that what exactly it has to go to in terms of schools and principals and kind of how it's used. There's things that it can be used for, but it doesn't say how it has to be used. So I want to get your take on how should we have state executive directors on, how should they be thinking about with their members in their state about how they advocate for those dollars at the very local level to say, principals, we know what we need right now in schools. So just a general kind of advocacy advice on that.
I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity, and you're right. When those funds come down, it's pretty ambiguous on how they're supposed to be spent. I think having a conversation beginning immediately with the chief state school officers in those states is going to be key. Again, most legislatures are not going to be in session when that money comes down. And so it's going to be a chief state school officer or the governor's office that are probably most apt to be trying to figure out how to get that money into the districts and where it will go. I also think that we're going to need to watch a couple of things. We had a Congressional Budget Office originally at the beginning of the year thought that we would have a 3% growth in gross domestic product. And right now we're seeing that we're actually negative 3% for the year. And so that's going to be on a lot of people's minds for economic reasons. And I think we're going to have to watch 17 states right now to see what this actually looks like when those funds come in. And those 17 states are the ones that have joined 3 of these regional little packs of governors. There's 3 of them on the Western front, California, Oregon, and Washington. There's about 7 of them in the Northeast area, including New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts, and then there's a Midwestern one. Those 17 states actually make up over half of our nation's economy. And so I think they're actually going to be more of the crystal ball that can help us to see where those funds are actually being utilized in those states and what's being done creatively there. And those 17 states, again, to take up half of our nation's economy, that's not including Texas, that's not including Florida, that's not including Georgia. And so those packs where you've got bipartisan governors actually looking at this, I think there may be some uniformity in also how they're going to distribute some of those state funds.
Thanks for that. Yeah, and then my last question is, there's been a lot of talk, especially in the last couple of weeks, and just what summer programs could look like and summer learning. Both, I think, the question of, you know, what does it look like in terms of kind of programming, funding around that, and then, you know, some potential sticky issues around staffing and teacher contracts and sort of all these things. What are some of the things that you're looking at in terms of just that whole prospect of a much more robust, you know, summer programming across the country?
So we don't have a lot around staffing, and I think that is going to be a very difficult issue for a lot of districts and principals to be looking at. I can tell you there's a big push from a lot of people that we've talked with, especially out of DC, but a lot of media who are saying, you know, we have to have summer school. We need to have summer school for all kids to make sure that we don't have this summer slip. And I think that's going to be a district by district decision. I mean, summer school for all kids, and there's been a bunch of op-eds about that. That's probably a 20% increase in the K-12 expense for the state and the district. And I don't know during this economy if that funding is actually going to be available to actually do that. I think there are some good summer programs that some districts will do a great job finding money to keep moving, because it's important for the demographic of students that they're serving. And it's also important for helping those kids get ready for what will be next. But we're seeing a lot more discussions that are talking about how they're not sure there will be any summer programming. They're not sure that there will be any ability to have those services available.
Thank you so much.
It's tough to speak on this stuff when there's a lot of dark and unfortunately stormy information and not as much sunlight.
You're right, Jeremy. Get your thought on a notion here put forth by Marguerite Rosa, a Georgetown University K-12 finance professor, who I'd like to mention will be doing a webinar for us in AASA on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday at 12 p.m. Eastern time. I'd like to invite all of you to join us for that. But she studied cuts during the last recession, and she says that legislatures will likely first cut new initiatives such as pre-K programs, counselors, and programs for English language learners before considering cuts to states' funding formulas, which could force districts to enact furloughs and layoffs. What are your thoughts on that?
We've seen a lot of states with a lot of investments as the economy got better, especially in early learning and some of those other programs you mentioned. And we will see states cut those first. Part of the reason is, like with early learning funding, a lot of governors, especially a lot of Republican governors, believe that that was the right place to invest. But that's not in their constitutional requirement in many states for K-12 education. So it's easier to cut some of those services than it is to cut the K-12 funding, which in some states there have been legal rulings on the state must stay at this level or must have this minimum. And we saw in 2008 and 2009, and Marguerite has done great research on this, a lot of states cut even below what those legal rulings from their state Supreme Court said had to be the bare minimum. The economy just required them to cut below, or they didn't have the support to actually look for additional revenue to maintain that minimum level. But I think we will see the ancillary programs cut first, and then they will go into the heart of what's necessary. Higher ed is also going to be a tough one, which took some very difficult cuts, higher percentage than K-12 usually during that last recession.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left, and I would like to go back to Nikki and see if we have any other questions in the chat box for Jeremy, Jennifer, or Danny.
Did you have one? It is, how does the impact with this pandemic affect the fundings with SEL, especially when we will need it even more for the future at this point?
So this is a really tough one. We do some work with the Wallace Foundation, who's invested a lot in some social emotional learning pilot programs across the country. Just context, like for their investments in multiple states, the assessment that was supposed to be given this spring was the assessment by which they would see if their SEL programs were actually working. And there's no assessment now in those states where they invested a lot of money. I think that it's going to be a focus. I worry that SEL is going to fall into the same category that I talked about equity, where it is a discussion, but it does not become a policy issue that actually moves.
Nikki, if there are no other questions in the chat box, I'd like to see if Danny wants to mention briefly anything about the CARES Act or any funding related issues right now.
Yeah, you know, more to come. I will continue to send out updates. The quick kind of overview is in the CARES Act, as was mentioned, there's two pots of funding that matter to principals. One is the governor's funding pot, which is a $3 billion pot of funding that just was released yesterday and is going out to states. Governors have the autonomy to decide where that goes in terms of K-12 higher ed, kind of any of that. So it's an opportunity to engage with your governor's office. But it's you know, it's $3 billion in a state like Virginia. It's $60 million. I mentioned the $13 billion that is coming down the road. So that is currently at the Department of Ed. It's going to be released, I'm hearing next week, to SEAs. And then state education agencies then have to turn around and push down 90% of that to districts. And so that's the conversation we're having about opportunities really for principals to engage on that, because it's going down to districts, but there is not, as Jeremy mentioned, it's pretty wide open in terms of what districts can do. One of the things that they can do is if they think that maybe, you know, we should maybe squirrel away some funds here for a few months, 6 months, because we don't know what's going to happen. Technically, they could do that. So if they don't hear from schools about needs and what they need those funds for, that can happen. So anyway, that's what's currently been passed. Just looking ahead real quick, we have asked for, with other national groups, with the school boards, the national school boards, with AASA and other groups. We last week we requested $175 billion in the next package. Sounds like a lot. It is a lot. In 2009, that amount was like 50 billion, but it's a double whammy now. There's just a lot more. Everything that Jeremy said about all the costs, it's gonna be bad, and it's gonna be bad for a while. And so we're shooting big, and we're hoping that we get something. It's not going to probably be that, but we're hoping for something sizable here in the next coming months. And we will obviously keep you all informed on that. And just the last flag on that, we sent an advocacy alert out yesterday and asked all NAESP members to do that action alert and reach out to their member of Congress and tell them why that funding is really, really needed right now. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Danny. And we're also working on maybe a template that state leaders can use to have these conversations with the governor, the state education agency chiefs. As Jeremy mentioned, there's a great opportunity for those conversations in the coming days. Jeremy, Jennifer, we've got about 2 minutes left. Jeremy, any other last words to give to these state leaders online with us?
I think just keep doing the great work you're doing in these extremely difficult times. You're trying to educate children across your areas during a global pandemic and an economic crisis. And reach out to NAESP and to us at Education Commission of the States, because that's what we're here for, to help you with information you need or policies that can assist as you're trying to figure out how to make it through what's probably going to be the next 12 to 18 months.
And give us the website address so that they can pull up all the information that Jennifer talked about.
Absolutely. It's at ecs.org, and you just hit the research button and you can go straight to our COVID report, which we have, which is updated every Wednesday.
Yeah, I love those every morning. The first thing I do when I get into the office is look at your update, just some great information. My sincere appreciation to Jeremy Anderson and Jennifer Thomsen from the Education Commission of the States and our own Danny Carlson. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us and inform us on this timely topic. And for those that were on today, we recorded this, and so we'll be putting that out. And thanks to Nikki for organizing. And Nikki, any final words here?
No, just really appreciative for everybody being able to take the time to tune in. And I just wanted to remind everybody, there are a lot of questions on the back end about resources and whatnot. NAESP has established the Coronavirus Task Force, which is chaired by our president, David Wick. Danny Carlson is also a member on the task force. Those resources are updated and posted on a weekly basis. It's ongoing, and there's just a lot of great information that you can find in there. That link is posted on NAESP's main webpage. It's easily accessible. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.
Yeah, and by the way, all of those COVID-19 resources are free to any administrator, whether they're NAESP members or not. So please promote it, take advantage of it. And we hope to see all of you again on Tuesday at 12 p.m. when we have the webinar with Margarita Rosa, Georgetown University. And thank you again for joining us, and hope you have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Jeremy and Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you.